So today the focus is on climate change. Arguably, it's the most pressing planetary crisis since it affects virtually the entire planet. It affects our survival, and affects all aspects of our lives and at many different levels of society. It's also one of the most contested topics in the real world of politics, which I think is surprising because there's very wide agreement on the problem. There's even a fair bit of agreement on ways to address the problem. And yet it involves some of the toughest politics that we have in the world today. Now, I should warn you, I'm going to try to give you a nice, big background and lots of information about this topic. But like a lot of topics that you'll be doing in this course, there are on climate politics or classes on environmental politics and sustainability politics in political science. Professors Kate Neville and Jessica Green on the St. George campus teach courses on these topics, so I encourage you to take them if you want to go deeper. Today, I'm going to focus mainly on the political aspects of climate change and why it's so challenging to address. And I'm going to talk a lot about the global efforts, although, as I said, it's a problem that really does affect different layers and different levels. So we'll be getting into what's happening at the domestic level and societal level as well. So you've probably all heard of the Paris Agreement, and I'll be talking a little bit more about it later. It just so happens that as we speak, there is the annual negotiations that go on, the sort of updating of the Paris Agreement every year. This is COP30, that stands for Conference of the Parties. The parties are states, another issue that I'm going to get into. So it so happens to be going on right now. If we have time at the end, I'll give you a little update of what's happening there, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what these are about. So this is just a slide of pictures from last week of various negotiations and discussions. This is what UN negotiations look like. Some of it's more casual, some of it's more formal. And this is also what's going on at the COP. Okay? So you can see there were large protests outside of the venue. There are also protests inside the venue of folks who are feeling like the COP isn't doing enough, feeling like there's too much corporate control, feeling like it's not listening enough to Indigenous voices. And although I'm told this was a bit of an exaggeration, you'll see there's some police there at the front. The protests have not been violent, but it does mean that there is security around there. And this, again, is sort of the atmosphere that you have at these international meetings. Okay, so just a brief outline of what I'm going to cover today. So I'm going to begin by talking about the political challenge, okay, and go into quite a bit of detail about why it's such a difficult problem to address and at various different levels. And then we'll talk about the responses, the political responses to climate change and how the framing and the way we think about how to respond to these problems can really affect the kinds of political action that we get. And whether we think about a problem in a way that's appropriate or not can lead to action that may be more or less successful. And then I'm going to spend the last bit of the lecture talking about how we're doing. How well are these political responses doing? How well is action responding to the problem of climate change? Okay, so let's launch in and start with the political challenge of climate change. So I'm going to start with the global dynamics. And there's really three conditions of international politics that make addressing really any global environmental problem, but especially climate change, quite difficult. So let's start with scientific uncertainty and complexity. So I have to admit that I've been lecturing on this for a very long time. And 20 years ago, I would have spent a long time saying, yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty. It's a very complex problem and so on. Ironically, there's not that much scientific uncertainty around climate change. The science is actually really, really solid. We know that there's human-induced climate change. We know that human activities are leading to warming and various kinds of changes around the planet. And the evidence really corresponds to what the science says. So let me just throw up a few quick slides, and you've probably seen these before. I think people, learn about this in high school and so on. But just to give you a little bit of the evidence, so this is a diagram. ppm stands for part per million, and you can just look over the past million years and where we are with carbon dioxide, and you'll see that we are in unprecedented territory, at least in the recent history of the planet. Okay, so no controversy there. And then the matching of the temperature to this rise in carbon dioxide is pretty much exactly what the scientists predict. Okay, the squiggly line is the squiggly line is the temperature, the smooth line is the carbon dioxide. And as you'll see, they're very highly correlated in terms of temperature. And we're at about 1.5 degrees now above pre-industrial levels. Okay, this is again, a diagram of the temperatures themselves. You can see this is annual temperature fluctuations. And just let me put on the next slide, which is the last 10 years. Okay, now these years aren't in order because these are the warmest years on record that we have. Okay, so last year was actually a record. Last year actually surpassed the 1.5 degree target that was in the Paris Agreement, the aspirational target. But the last 10 years have set records. There's, annual fluctuations and so on, but the evidence is pretty uncontroversial. Okay, so the science is pretty uncontroversial. Why then is scientific? Why do I even mention science as a particular challenge when it comes to global environmental problems? Because there is more uncertainty around how we adapt to climate change. There's uncertainty around what's going to work to address the problem, how climate change manifests or how the causes interact in different parts of the world, in different environments, in different regions. The oceans, tropics, Arctic regions, mountain regions, and so on. There's more uncertainty around that, and there's still lots of work to do there. There's also a lot of work that needs to be done on how what we do to address climate change might interact with both the climate itself and with our social systems and our economic systems. So there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done on, well, if we take certain kinds of actions, what are the economic consequences going to be, for example? How is it going to affect people and communities? What are the justice implications of dealing with different types of problems? What about different ways of knowing and living? Local populations might have different understandings of how they're interacting with the climate. And if something happens, if you do something, how that's going to affect their ability to farm or their ability to live the way that they've been living. And that may be very different in different places, and local knowledge might be different than the kind of top-down scientific Western knowledge that we have. Okay, so all of those things, there is more uncertainty and complexity about. Another problem is misinformation and obfuscation, and sometimes just outright denial. There's a little less of that now, but there's certainly a lot of misinformation out there and attempts to obfuscate the evidence to try to get, say, a negotiation outcome that you want or a political outcome that you want. So let me just give a couple of examples of that. So the negotiations that I talked about, part of the negotiations are to do with the science and recognizing the science that's out there, say that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has come up with. So there were meetings of something called the Subsidiary Body for Scientific and Technical Advice. And one of the jobs of this body is to make a decision about how they're going to interpret the scientific advice that's out there. And there was a World Meteorological Organization report that came into this body. And there was a big debate So you're asking, whoops, what are they doing? What are they doing in those rooms? They're debating the words that they put into these negotiation texts. So one of the big debates was whether or not they would note the WMO findings with concern, which is what it said in the report, or they would just take note of the findings. And that sounds very, I don't know, esoteric and who cares? But those words matter because those words are then made available to hold governments to account to act on those things. If you just take note of something, well, that doesn't mean that you have to do very much. If you express concern or make a decision about what you need to do to act in response to it, that matters. Another debate that's happening right now at the COP is around a 1.5-degree goal. So in the Paris Agreement, what states agreed to is to keep temperatures within 2 degrees Celsius of pre-industrial levels. But there's an aspirational goal of keeping the world within 1.5 degrees. So there's a debate going on right now about whether or not to make reference to the 1.5-degree goal when they're talking about the commitments that governments are making. In other words, to try to match the commitments that all countries are making to whether or not they will achieve the 1.5-degree goal, which is a lot harder, or the 2-degree goal. And what's happening in the negotiations right now is that a lot of states are saying, well, why even talk about the 1.5-degree goal? We're already there. And so it's not scientific to say that we can reach the 1.5-degree goal. And other states are saying, well, hold on a second. If you look at what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says, it says, well, we might overshoot, but we should still try to reach it because the consequences of not reaching it are going to be quite severe. So this is the way in which science interacts with negotiations and so on, even though the scientists generally agree on the problem. And so finally, just the basic point is science doesn't equal political action. You can have the best science, but it doesn't mean that you're going to get the political action that you want. It doesn't tell you what policies are appropriate. Okay. So that's just the point I made about the 1.5 versus 2-degree goal. This is just a little chart just to bring the point home. And by the way, I'm happy to share these slides. Do you share your slides with this? Yeah, I'm happy to share the slides after, so don't worry about writing down the details. But this is just the difference between what 1.5 and 2 degrees means. So in terms of the consequences of that debate, okay? So for example, the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees in terms of, say, drought is that drought will affect about 200 million more people if you're 2 degrees above as opposed to 1.5 degree above. And you can see along all these measures, all these things we associate with climate change, the differences are quite severe, whether it's 1.5 or 2 degrees. And of course, 3 degrees is much worse. And everyone agrees we don't want to go there. Okay, second problem, sovereignty. So I don't know if any of you are taking a international relations class along with this, or if you've talked about sovereignty or the problem of sovereignty in the global system. But the problem of sovereignty is one that's particularly bad for environmental problems because it creates a kind of dilemma. So the international system is anarchic, okay? There's no world government. So to deal with international problems or global problems, you need states, usually, to work together, to cooperate, to agree. No one can force states, or at least there's no world government to force states to do things. And so what you try to do is you try to build agreements or build collective action to try to deal with a particular problem. The challenge is that environmental problems don't respect borders. Okay? Things that you do in one country affect what happens in another country. So any country acting individually is not going to be able to respond to the problem, especially in a problem like climate change, which is so global in nature. But states also jealously guard their sovereignty. They want control over their natural resources. They don't want other states to tell them what to do with their natural resources or with their development. When I attend UN meetings, what I hear more often than anything else is, quote, "There is no one size fits all." Okay? And this happens all the time in environment and sustainability negotiations, where they say there can't be one thing that every state has to do. Different states should be treated differently. We have special circumstances. It's easy for you to do it. It's hard for us to do it. We're a country that's a coastal country. We're a country that has poverty. We're a country that has a certain way of life, and they don't want to be told internationally what to do. So that's a problem in international politics, but it's a little worse with climate change. The second problem with sovereignty is that states aren't really the ones who are polluting. Of course, they have some control over what happens in their countries, but even if you got states to agree, most of the activity that causes climate change is caused by corporations and by you and me, by individuals, and by communities and how we live. So it's very challenging to get an international agreement. It's not just a state deciding we're going to put a tariff on or we're not going to put a tariff on. It's doing a lot inside the country in order to address the problem. And governments have different interests. Governments may want to protect markets as opposed to protect the environment. So getting agreement to deal with that is a challenge. And finally, there's the problem of equity in development. There is unequal distribution of wealth and power around the world, both within and between countries. So there are arguments out there that the North should take more responsibility for the environment because the North has benefited from development. The North has benefited from industrialization, and that therefore, because they've overexploited the environment, that the South should pay more, or sorry, that the North should pay more. And there's also legacies of colonialism, legacies of unequal development, and that these have exacerbated environmental harms, and therefore there is a responsibility of the North. However, there is also internal distribution problems. So it's not a straightforward story. So if you look at who are the biggest polluters are not necessarily located in the North. But if you look at per capita emissions, they still tend to be more in northern countries. But of course, there are wealthy people all over the world who their per capita emissions are much higher than poor people who might be in the same country. So let me again give you just a few little illustrations of this. Okay, with the key question in the background: how do you divide responsibility when it's a very complicated landscape? Okay, so here's a diagram, a chart of historically the top 10 emitters. Sorry, the historical emissions for the top 10 emitters. So you actually see that China is way at the top. Okay, China is by far the largest emitter in the world. Now, of course, they weren't always that way, but China is growing incredibly. And most other countries their emissions have been relatively stable, and they are starting to come down. And there's some question about whether China's peaking or not, which I'm going to get to a bit later. But if you look at per capita emissions, the US is still way at the top. And India is way down at the bottom with the lowest per capita emissions amongst the 10 top emitters, okay, with other countries in between. And again, you can see it's complicated. Iran is in there as a top emitter because Iran is an oil-producing state, and so they are emitting a lot compared to some other countries. Then if you look at historical emissions, so this is where there are debates about things like, should there be reparations? Should there be transfers of money from north to south? to deal with these kinds of emissions. And here, again, historically, the United States is way above other countries. So, how then have the international community, how has it dealt with this responsibility issue? Okay, so I don't know if I'm dating myself, but Spider-Man's still popular. I'm not sure. But if people have watched the various Spider-Man movies, there's the famous slogan, with great power comes great responsibility. So that's what developing countries want. Sadly, it hasn't always worked that way. The major emitters haven't always been willing to take on that great responsibility, but there has been an attempt to try to develop various norms to deal with this problem. So one of the big norms in climate change is this idea of common but differentiated responsibility. So this is written into the Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's written into some other treaties. And the idea here is that everybody has a responsibility to deal with the problem, but that it should be differentiated. Okay, some countries should do more than others. And just to put a little bit of a finer point on how difficult this is and how controversial, you would think, oh, okay, well, all developing countries would be really together on this, right? They would say that the northern countries, the great powers, and so on, should take on more responsibility for their emissions and so on. But the challenge is that what should that be based on? Should it be based on historical responsibility, or should it be based on capability? Okay, who actually has the ability to do it? So let me just give you a little anecdote about an exchange that happened when the Paris Agreement was being negotiated. Okay, and this was an exchange between India and the Marshall Islands. So the Marshall Islands is a small territory that will probably be inundated, will probably be flooded over the next century because of sea level rise, because of climate change. And there is an exchange between the foreign minister of the Marshall Islands, a person named Tony de Bruyn, who is advocating for very strong action and that all the major emitters should take strong actions and cut emissions and so on. And with Prakash Javadekar, who was the environment minister of India. So the delegate for the Marshall Islands made this big plea. You really have to do something. It's terrible. You have to take stronger action. Paris Agreement isn't going far enough, or the negotiations aren't going far enough. And then the environment minister of India responded, and I'm quoting, "So what?" Okay. So this is an illustration of how, when the hard politics come about getting countries to take responsibility, even though India is a top 10 emitter, it can become very challenging in those negotiations because country interests can often get in the way when there's a combination of factors that a country is trying to deal with, including their economic development, including access to electricity, access to energy, and so on. Okay, so what's happened then with common but differentiated responsibilities is a couple of things. One is that it only applies to states. Okay, it doesn't apply to corporations, doesn't apply to individuals, and so on. It's a agreement among states. Differentiation is actually widely accepted. So if you look at all the international agreements, there is pretty wide agreement that different countries ought to have different sets of obligations. There's an understanding that the major industrialized countries have more of an obligation and have more of a capability to do more. The problem is that whenever there is an attempt to link this idea to some kind of liability, to say you're responsible for historical emissions, or culpability because of your emissions that caused the problem, you then owe other countries or you can be sued because you've caused harm to other countries, that is resisted. So if you look at the negotiations text, there's a lot of footnotes saying, we do not interpret common but differentiated responsibility as an admission of any liability or any culpability on our country to have to do something. Interestingly, in practice, there are lots of ways in which this is worked out. There are funds and so on to try to produce financing to help countries with less resources adapt and so on. But there is no admission of liability or culpability. And it also has caused tensions, as I just mentioned, when it comes to countries who are now amongst the highest emitters, but were that are now rising economies, that are established major economies, but for a long time considered themselves to be developing countries. So this is made for some very challenging negotiations, as we'll see in a minute when I get to how the world has actually responded to these things. One thing that, one bit of progress on this issue was that in 2022, there was agreement on something called loss and damage. And this was a phrase that was in the Paris Agreement, but for the first time in 2022, an actual fund was set up. And the idea here is that this isn't a fund to help with adaptation. This isn't a fund to sort of, help countries meet their Paris Agreement. It's the idea that loss and damage is something that happens when you can no longer adapt. So there are some countries that, for example, won't be viable countries anymore, like Tuvalu, okay, which simply won't exist if climate change progresses in the way that we want. And so the idea here is that when adaptation is not possible, that there is a fund set up to try to figure out or to try to help in terms of these losses that can't ever be recovered. Even then, the United States in particular has been very clear that, again, this does not, agreeing to this is not an admission of any liability. And what they're concerned about is that they will be asked to do reparations for harms that have been done. And interestingly, for those of you who are interested in international law, there was a big legal decision this summer by the International Court of Justice that basically said that states can be held to account for what they've agreed to in the Paris Agreement. So this is a very live debate. Okay, the governance problem. Okay, so I've talked about all these things that are in international politics that make it hard to deal with this issue. Let's move on to what makes it a particularly hard governance issue. So I've talked about collective action. I'm going to come back to that, so I don't want to talk about it too much. But climate change also has, I'm just getting my watch here so I see what time it is. Okay, climate change also has some features that make it a particularly pernicious problem to deal with. So people use all kinds of phrases to talk about it. A colleague of mine, Kelly Levin, has used the phrase, it's a super wicked problem. No, worse than a wicked problem. There's a book by a scholar at Oxford named Tom Hale called Long Problems. And climate change is one of those long problems. So let me give you some features of climate change that these authors refer to that make it especially challenging. So the first one is that there are generational gaps between the causes of climate change and the results of climate change. So, when I put that chart on before, if I were to make these arguments in 1970 and 1980, when the science was first appearing, you'd go, oh, yeah, that's, maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. It's down the road. We don't have to worry about it. Because you don't see the effects right when you do it, unlike a lot of other public policy problems. When COVID hit, you saw the effects right away. We had to act. It was a very short problem. But climate change is a very long problem, okay, where what we do has effects way in the future. And so short-term incentives must be overcome so that we don't delay action. The incentives are almost always not to do anything because it can be expensive, or at least the transition can be expensive, even if in the short run, there might be ways to make it more beneficial. So your short-term interests are against your long-term interests. There's also the problem of generations. So you're all relatively young, at least in terms of, where I am, um, but you didn't vote until recently. So maybe when you were in public school or high school, you were hearing about this problem. But whether or not you were concerned about it, you had to convince your parents or hope that your parents or grandparents would be concerned about the problem. And then there's the problem of future generations who don't have a voice at all. So when those who are affected might be in the future, how do you take account of those interests? How do you deal with that intergenerational problem that climate change really brings to the forefront when the worst effects, even though we're feeling the effects now, might be 25, 30, 50 years in the future? Exacerbating that is that time is running out. And again, think about the ironic debate that they're having right now in Brazil about, oh, well, it's not scientific to say 1.5 degrees because we're already at 1.5 degrees. I mean, think about the irony of that. We've already passed it, it's already baked in. So this year might be a little below, temperatures fluctuate year to year. But basically, there is no way that we are not going to hit 1.5 degrees. No way. It's already baked into with our emissions where they are now. Okay. The question is whether we can somehow come back down through various means, through net zero, et cetera, et cetera. So time is running out. If we don't act, the problem is going to happen, and we have to act now. And finally, the same people who are causing the problem are the ones who we need to have solutions. So with a lot of other public policy problems, there's kind of a target. Oh, we need to get, this corporation to stop doing something. The government needs to do more. There's certain groups in society who we want to change their views, or we want to get them to do something else. Problem with climate change is pretty much everybody is a part of it. We're part of it in the way we live. We're part of it in our societies. And so it's very challenging to think of public policies, changes to our ways of life, transformations that are really going to have the kinds of societal change that we want. So it makes it a really, really difficult problem. Okay? So the question is, what do we do? How do we then deal with this really complicated problem that affects all these different parts of life? Okay. So let's look then at the various kinds of political responses. And I'm going to start with the international responses. The first way that governments tried to deal with the problem was to think about it as a problem of the global commons. So what are global commons? Global commons are things like the atmosphere. Everybody has access to the atmosphere. We can't prevent others from using the atmosphere. We need the atmosphere in order to survive on the planet. So it's a commons. The high seas, which are not controlled by any state. Um, uh, those are kind of the classic ones that people point to as commons. And there was a feeling that, okay, carbon emissions, the atmosphere, it's a commons problem. Okay, we all need a clean atmosphere. So we're going to create a kind of carbon budget. Okay, there's a certain amount of carbon that we can emit, and we have to get everyone to cooperate in order to deal with it. And then when we cooperate, then we'll try to deal with this commons problem, because in a commons problem, when it's a public good, or in the literature, sometimes these are referred to as common pool resources. So a public good means everybody has access to it and you can't prevent people from having access. A common pool resource is a resource that you can prevent people from having access to, but everybody wants to rely on. And so there's kind of a debate about how we treat climate change. But the point is, with both of those things, there's an individual incentive to take advantage. There's an individual incentive to pollute. There's an individual incentive to industrialize and have, fossil energy, use fossil energy. But collectively, we don't want to do it because everybody's going to be harmed. Right? And that's the classic cooperation problem in international politics. Okay? The problem of collective action. Okay? And as I said before, no world government to stop free riders. If you cut your emissions, what if somebody else doesn't? Okay, that's going to cost you more. It's unfair. You're going to be a free rider. You want to prevent that. So lots of international negotiations are dealing with these collective action problems. Okay, so the assumption was climate change was like this. We have this problem, too much greenhouse gases. There's an incentive to pollute. We have to get everybody to agree. We're going to have a treaty that's going to say, you can only pollute that much, you can only pollute that much, you can only emit that much. And we all agree, and there's an overall amount we have to pollute. It's been calculated, actually, how that relates to different temperature increases, and we're going to divide it up. And how do we divide it up fairly? And who has to go first? And how much are we going to pay the people who can't afford to cut their emissions? Okay. So that was the idea. That was what governments thought was the way to address this problem. And there are some problems that are very easy, not easy, they're all hard, but some problems that were addressed that way. And this is what they had in their minds. So in the 1980s and early 1990s, when the first climate change treaty was being negotiated, they had the problem of ozone in their minds. Can I just say a show of hands? How many people know about ozone depletion? Most of you? Okay, great, all of you. Excellent. Okay, so I don't have to explain too much about what it is. You're all veterans. When I was your age, I didn't know what ozone depletion was, but anyway, that's great. So ozone depletion was dealt with very much in this way, okay? So the idea is you have these harmful chemicals, which you all know about, which deplete the ozone layer, lets ultraviolet radiation in, is very bad for cancer, causes other kinds of problems to the environment and to species and so on. And lo and behold, there is a chemical or a group of chemicals that cause this problem. CFCs and HCFCs, which are some of the replacement chemicals. So what we have to do is we have to regulate this chemical. And we're going to get countries to stop using this chemical and companies to stop producing it. And eventually, we're going to stop the use of this chemical, and then we're going to heal the ozone layer. It's been remarkably successful. Okay? There was a treaty. The first treaty was in 1985. The Montreal Protocol, which was a protocol of that treaty, was in 1987 that actually started to ban some of the chemicals. 172 countries are part of this treaty. And there's all kinds of neat things in the treaty. So it had differentiation. Okay, so I'll answer your question in just a second. I know, easy case. Go back. Yes. Whoop, wrong way. There we go. Sorry. Okay. That was my very fancy graphic. Okay. In the agreement, there was an amendment that said, we're going to create a fund for developing countries so that they can phase out the chemicals later than developed countries. And they can come on board later. When there were replacement chemicals, there was treaties around those and around the use of those. And as you see, there are amendments that were, several amendments that were made. A very, very successful treaty. Okay. Easy case. Okay. Why is it an easy case? Well, it's an easy case because there is a replacement chemical. Okay. When they first negotiated it, they didn't know that there was. But DuPont developed some replacement chemicals that were not as harmful to the ozone layer. So there's a replacement chemical. Second, you had the major countries in the world, the major northern countries who really cared about the issue. They were very concerned about cancer rates in their countries. It had a lot of publicity in the United States, for example, In fact, the United States moved ahead of the international negotiations because the public was very aware and mobilized around this particular issue. And it wasn't particularly expensive to deal with it because there were replacements. So the corporate world was on board. So it's a very easy case. Okay, so how does this look for climate change? So this is the kind of conventional way to think about it. And some of this is taken from the article that was assigned, if you had a chance to read it, on the fractal climate problem. So the challenge is emission reductions. The metaphor is a kind of global commons, okay, or a national carbon budget that we have to protect and prevent from going over a certain limit. The goal is to figure out the distribution of emission reductions and then give them out. And the political response then is to produce a multilateral treaty. And this is exactly what was attempted with the first climate change treaties. So the political response is you get a treaty in 1992, the Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's got common but differentiated responsibility in it, just like the Ozone Treaty did, where different countries have different obligations, whether you're a wealthy country or a less wealthy country. And it says you should stabilize the climate, but it didn't have a lot of specifics in it about what the specific obligations were. So then in 1997, you had a protocol, just like the Montreal Protocol for ozone. This was the Kyoto Protocol for climate change. And the Kyoto Protocol tried to lay out what the specific obligations are. So in the Kyoto Protocol, there are mandatory emission reductions for developed countries. Okay? There is a group of developed countries. They all had to, on average, have 5.2% reductions. At that time, the baseline was 1990. And it was negotiated. Canada, you should do 6%. UK, you should do 8%. US, okay, you only have to do 3% because it's harder. Japan, you have to do this much, right? And it was written down what each country had to do. And if it was really hard for you to do it, there were these market mechanisms. It's super hard for us to cut back on our emissions, but we'll plant forests in another country and get credit for that. And we'll use this mechanism in order to have flexibility so we can do emissions where it's cheaper to do so, emission reductions where it's cheaper to do so. That's written into it. And there was a compliance mechanism. If you didn't do it, there were going to be consequences. Anyone know what happened to the Kyoto Protocol? Okay. Failed. Biggest disaster in climate change governance. Okay. US pulls out of it. Other countries don't adhere to it. Countries refuse to sign on. Doesn't work. Okay. Technically, it still exists, but basically it doesn't work. It was the wrong model. It was the wrong model for climate change. So why was it the wrong model? Because with climate change, unlike some other international environmental problems, although like some, it really requires a lot of domestic policy change in order to reach these targets. Okay? And so we're up against the sovereignty problem that I was talking about earlier. You've got states negotiating these things, but ultimately what you have to do is you have to transition in your own country. You have to transition your energy systems. That's really the only way to deal with the problem. And so you have to do things at multiple levels and in multiple sectors. So that's a big problem. Second, the international markets were resisted for all kinds of reasons. And that's a much longer story. If we have time at the end, I can answer some questions about it. But basically, there was a feeling that states were trying to get out of their obligations. It was very difficult to calculate, to know whether or not these emissions were really happening or not. And countries didn't want to just pay other countries to fulfill their own obligations at home. There are regional carbon markets. In fact, we kind of have a carbon market in Canada to a degree. They tend to work better domestically, but internationally, they haven't worked too well, but they are back on the table in negotiations. So that'll be interesting to see how that works. Third reason, there was a misunderstanding about collective action. So this is a little bit in the political science weeds, but the idea of international collective action is that states are constantly comparing themselves to other states. So they're saying, United States is saying, oh, if we have to cut back emissions, why doesn't China have to cut back as much as us? If Canada is saying, why should we have to do this if Japan is only doing X, Y, or Z, or India is not doing this much? And so the idea is, if you think about states like individuals and they're comparing to each other, they're constantly looking at, well, am I being taken advantage of by these other states? The problem with climate change is that the distributional politics, who's benefiting, who's not, is much more important in the case of climate change domestically, I would argue, than it is internationally. So states are actually less concerned, they might be a little bit concerned, but they're less concerned about comparing themselves to other states than the communities or companies or individuals or parts of society in a country are concerned about whether they are being taken advantage of vis-a-vis other companies who might benefit, or other people in different parts of the country who might benefit, and so on. So the distributional politics within countries is much worse than the distributional politics outside. The good news is, if you can deal with the domestic problem and figure out ways to transition internally, that can be a way, despite what's happening internationally, to make a lot of action. But it's kind of a misunderstanding that you can just negotiate this international treaty and it's going to solve the collective action problem. And finally, there is a challenge with climate change that Kyoto didn't really deal with the unequal costs and unequal effects. Okay? That's the problem that I was talking about earlier with development, with the distribution of emissions and so on. So equity and justice concerns loom very, very large whenever you're dealing with trying to address climate change. So fast forward over many phases and many COPs and many negotiations, and we get the Paris Agreement. So I assume, again, most of you have heard of the Paris Agreement. I'm not going to go over it in too much detail. But let me give you the basic parameters of it, because it tried to deal with some of these problems. So you see the comparison to the Kyoto Protocol, which I said didn't pass. So in terms of shared goals, so they're not too dissimilar, although the Paris Agreement actually goes further than the Kyoto Protocol. Kyoto Protocol just refers to stabilizing the climate. It wasn't very specific. It was too hard to negotiate. The science had advanced by the time of the Paris Agreement in 2015. So as I said, there is agreement on a 2% target above pre-industrial levels, and with an aspirational target. They're not committed to it, but they want to get there to 1.5. Okay, so good. Participation. This is key. In the Paris Agreement, every state has obligations. Remember I said in Kyoto, it was only developed countries who had obligations, or at least obligations to cut emissions. In the Paris Agreement, every state has an obligation. Every state has to submit their commitments, their what's called NDCs, their nationally determined contributions. These are not negotiated. It's not a distribution. It's not that they sit around in a big room and say, you have to do this and you have to do that. Every country comes to the table with what they can do domestically. So those are the NDCs. Its legal status, and this is controversial, it's less binding. States did not want to be bound as they were to specific targets in the Kyoto Protocol. So there are some rules around accountability, but it's not binding in terms of if they fail, there's some kind of compliance mechanism like there was in the Kyoto Protocol. And it's supposed to ratchet up over time. Everybody knows that what's in the Paris Agreement is not going to be enough to get us to 1.5 or 2 degrees, let alone 1.5. And so every 5 years, there's something called the global stock take. We just had one where they look at how we're doing and where you're expected to increase your commitments. Okay, so Big differences. The main one, the really big difference is it's universal and it's bottom up. Everyone comes in with their commitments rather than being negotiated and distributed. So a colleague and mine have looked at some of these developments, and we've made an argument that even the Paris Agreement doesn't quite get it right. It doesn't go far enough because it's not responding to the true nature of the problem. Nothing wrong with the Paris Agreement. It's great that we have international action. It can be a piece of the action. But to deal with climate change, actually, you have to recognize that it is what we call a fractal problem. So that was the article that I think Professor Young distributed to people and asked you to read. So I hope you've had a look at it. But let me go over sort of just the high level arguments that we make in that paper. Okay, and the paper is really about how we have to think about this problem differently. You have to think about it differently than you might learn in an international relations class, or maybe even that you learned when you learned about it in high school or wherever you first heard about international action or how to deal with climate change. So first thing is that it has what we say are fractal characteristics. And this is a diagram of a fractal. You can see it in nature. Waves are fractals. You see it in all kinds of things where you basically have, as we describe it, repeated patterns at different scales. So the thing about climate change is that if you look at a problem like we reframe it as decarbonization, that's really what you have to do. You have to transition away from fossil energy. You have to decarbonize. I mean, there's other chemicals involved too. That if you look at it, say, at a small scale, like transportation or driving, that is part of the same system at a larger scale. Okay, so people talk a lot about EVs now, for example. But what you need for an EV, you can, I choose to buy an EV, okay, but you're in a society where, first of all, you need infrastructure to do that. Well, our infrastructure is built around fossil fuel, gas stations, and refineries and other sorts of things. But now we need to build charging stations. So there's an infrastructure around it. There's all kinds of interests lined up to support the fossil economy. Obviously, there's lots of money to be made. There's parts of the country in Canada that rely very much on fossil energy for income and employment. There are global markets in fossil energy that would be disrupted if you change it. So when you look at different scales, there's many reinforcing things that reinforce certain systems, whether they're energy systems or economic systems that reinforce certain kinds of patterns. So if you want to change that, you have to think about, okay, if you intervene, there's going to be lots that's going to push back against it, but how do you create cascades to disrupt the system that's being reinforced through these very self-similar patterns at different levels, okay, that are kind of self-organizing around reinforcing carbon lock-in. So that's the problem of transformation. How do you break out of that? So the problem's not simply collective action, but it's transformation. How do you break out of these reinforcing systems and try to make interventions that start to change that cascade, that create feedbacks that affect changes in other parts of the fractal? So instead of thinking about it like a collective action problem, we propose you think about it like a transformation problem. So the challenge isn't emission reductions, it's decarbonization, okay? Changing the ways in which we use energy. It's not just stopping emitting things like stopping CFCs, okay? It's changing our patterns of behavior so that we're less reliant on carbon energy. The metaphor is a global fractal as opposed to a global commons metaphor, a very different way of thinking about the global problem. And the goal is to disrupt carbon lock-in and catalyze transformation at multiple levels. Okay, not to distribute emissions and leave it up to whoever to do it, is to think about how you change those systems, how you change behaviors, how you change practices at multiple levels, and what you can do from a policy perspective to catalyze those changes, to encourage those changes, to incentivize those changes. And the political response then isn't simply have an international treaty and think, okay, states are going to just listen to that and do what they're supposed to do. Instead, you have to do things at multiple levels. You have to experiment, see what works, try all kinds of initiatives, multi-scalar action. So it's a very different way of thinking about how you deal with the problem. And I know lots of people, join NGOs and go to the international meetings and think that those international meetings are important, and they are important. But the kinds of activities and transformations and actions and initiatives and so on that we need are actually happening at all kinds of different scales. And interestingly, the Paris Agreement recognizes that in a way the Kyoto Agreement doesn't. So the Paris Agreement actually has clauses on the importance of non-state actors, which isn't in very many international treaties. And if you go to one of these meetings, cities are at these meetings, companies are at these meetings. That can be controversial. Sometimes the companies don't want stuff to happen, but some do. Some might be renewable energy companies. Of course, all kinds of individuals and communities are at these meetings. So these are just a few things to look at. C40 is a network of cities across the world that are taking all kinds of their own action and learning from one another about how to become more resilient, how to have climate targets, what works in cities, what doesn't work. There's a Powering Past Coal Alliance, which is trying to encourage phasing out of coal that many countries are involved with. So there's lots of action happening. And the Paris Agreement actually does go some way in recognizing that all of this different sort of action has to occur. Okay, so that was like the big political science part of the lecture. Okay. That gives you actually, I think, a really pretty good understanding of how international relations scholars and some other scholars think about this. So I want to spend the last sort of big chunk of the lecture talking about how we're doing. Okay. All this action, what's actually happening? Where are we? So I didn't make this up. This is, in a nutshell, how the UN thinks we're doing. Okay, we are off target. Okay, all those diagrams I showed you before probably gave you a sense of that, but again, the science is pretty clear. So this is the emissions gap report. It's put out by the United Nations Environment Program, and let's just dig into how off target we are. So there are a ton of these on the web. You can go look at them. They're diagrammed in different ways. This was one I thought was one of the more intuitive ones. So if you look at, this is this, nice big thermometer. We want to be in the green if we can be, right? That's the good place where we want to be. And yellow, orange, red, we really don't want to be in the red, and certainly we don't want to be in the black. That's, you don't even want to think about that. So where are we? It's putting us at 1.3 degrees. As I said, last year, we actually went way beyond that. We were 1.6, but on average, the senses were about at 1.3. Okay, remember what I said, the Paris aspirational target is 1.5. That's where countries agreed we want to try to keep within there. And 2 degrees is the one they committed to agreeing to. Then you look at policies and actions. So policies and actions are, if you look at the real world, if all of these policies and actions that states already have on the books actually worked in the way that they're expected to work, we would be at 2.6. Okay? I think this is by century's end. I think that's, by 2100. So that's saying everything that we're doing, and there is a lot that we're doing, everything that we're doing, we will only get to 2.6. Okay? And that's if it all works. Okay? If it doesn't all work, well, they're estimating about 3.3 degrees. And if you remember back to that other chart, there were big differences between 1.5, 2, and 3 degrees, what the consequences were going to be. Okay. Now, let's look at the 2030 to 35 targets based on the NDC. So this is based on what states have actually committed to when they have a concrete target of 2030 or 2035. And it's basically the same, almost no difference. Okay? This is what they've said, not even what they're doing plus what they say they're going to do. Now, if you have include the long-term targets, so these are based on the NDCs that have just been submitted. So remember I said we're in a global stock take year, so every 5 years they're supposed to submit new NDCs. So sorry, the stock take was last year. This year is the new NDCs. So about 140 countries have submitted them, and if you add them all up, where will we be? 2.2 degrees. So even with the new set of commitments, if every country followed through with them, every country did exactly what they said they were going to do, we would be at about 2.2 degrees, again, somewhere in the range of 1.8 to 2.8. So average 2.2 degrees. The most optimistic scenario is if you look at what countries committed in terms of their NDCs plus net zero, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, then it is possible, theoretically, we could stay within 2 degrees, okay? So read that as you will. That is just based on what has actually been done and what is said is going to be done. Okay, so if we wanted to reach 1.5, how much more would we have to do? So these are just some very rough numbers. This is put out by an NGO, a quite reliable NGO called Climate Watch. So renewables about 6 times faster than we're doing. Electric vehicles about 22 times faster than what we're doing. Electric vehicles are actually an interesting story because some people think we've reached a tipping point and that will start to happen more rapidly, but it has to be a lot more rapid. Increase in low carbon fuels 8 times faster, phase out of coal 5 times faster. Okay, so we have to do a lot. We have to move a lot faster. And that's that whole thing about time running out. Time is collapsing in terms of how much time we have to do things. Okay, so that's kind of the bad news story. The better news story is that we are doing a lot. Okay, it's not all bad news. So this is according to something called the Oxford Climate Hub. And the evidence here is kind of mixed in terms of how much the world is doing. And obviously, these are big aggregate numbers, and they've done a lot of work to figure this out. I think they're pretty reliable. They're pretty good. What do we see in this diagram? So we actually see that since 2020, there have been a lot more climate actions added. So that's good news. A lot of people thought after the pandemic that countries were going to retrench just like they did after the 2008 financial crisis and stop doing stuff. Economics is more important. We have to get the economy back on its feet. Let's not worry about climate change. In fact, that hasn't happened for the most part. There's lots of new climate policies all over the world. There was a bit of a dip in 2024. And in a minute, I'm going to talk about backlash, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why maybe that was. But was a bit of a dip, but overall, there's more climate action happening. Some other things are interesting that's happening. There's a lot more happening, at least the increases in the global south and in Asia in particular. Okay? Lots of climate action there. And that's an interesting story. It's a complicated story, but it does suggest that there are many, many countries on board with doing more. And in fact, countries who less traditionally were doing things are doing a lot more than they used to. And of course, the other punchline is we need to do more and faster. Okay, those were the 2 previous slides. Okay, so let me dig into this just a little bit to give you a sense of kind of the difficult politics around this and how we think about how serious to take these commitments. Okay, so this is an idea called net zero. Again, can I just see a show of hands? How many people have heard of net zero? Okay, a bunch of you. All right. So it's interesting. This has really come into the global consciousness in a very, very fast way. 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago, most people never talked about net zero. Now, virtually every country talks about net zero. Companies talk about net zero. It's become this kind of mantra about what we have to do deal with climate change. Where it comes from is actually Article 4 of the Paris Agreement. And what Article 4 says, more or less, is that you have to, achieve the 2-degree target by a net balance between sources of greenhouse gases and removal of greenhouse gases. Okay? So the Paris Agreement acknowledges that part of what you might have to do to reach certainly 1.5 is somehow remove carbon from the atmosphere. So that can be things like through land use changes, like forestry, et cetera, or through carbon capture and storage, or through some forms of geoengineering, that there's going to have to be carbon removal. But net zero means you're not putting anything more in. It's balancing out. You might still be emitting. We're still going to need fossil fuels, but we're going to take out as much as we put in. Okay. I'm going to park that. Some people think that that's controversial. There are challenges and problems with net zero. There's concerns it won't work. But that has become the global norm around climate action. So this is a little map of how the commitments to net zero looks pretty good if you look at this. It accounts for 74% of the emissions around the world. There are commitments to achieving net zero. That means countries accounting for 74% of the emissions. 77% of the GDP, so that is most of the global economy. 79% of the population, okay? So 80% of the population of the world is covered by net zero pledges. 140 countries out of, I always lose count, 200 and something countries that we have, so a lot of countries. And many cities. The companies, it doesn't look like a high number, but that's of the top 2,000 largest companies in the world. So over 60% of the world's largest corporations have committed to net zero in their emissions. And then they've broken it down by region too. Okay, so it looks very good. By the way, the green means that they've committed to net zero. The brown means they have said they're going to commit to net zero. And the blue means they've achieved net zero. So I think there's 2 countries there. Anyway, who claim to have met net zero. Okay, so looks really good. Now let's just dig into it a bit because these are pledges. So there has been some work on how well are countries actually doing? How serious do we take these pledges? And this goes to the implementation problem. Okay? There's lots of pledges, there's lots of commitments. What is actually happening on the ground? Okay, so actually the first thing is you'll notice the United States, which did have a net zero commitment, not anymore. Okay, under Trump, they have eliminated their net zero commitments. All right, I'm just going to give 2 examples to dig into. Okay, the first one is China, and I chose China because it is such an important country. It has 25% of the global emissions. Okay, 25% of global emissions come from China. In fact, if you look at their emissions, China now has more global emissions than the entire OECD, okay? All the developed countries put together. So again, this goes to the complication when we talk about equity and development and how to distribute things, okay? So massive, massive, massive impact and importance. Okay, so how are they doing with their net zero pledge? So China, good news is China has a net zero pledge. They have agreed to net zero by 2060. Paris Agreement says it should be 2050, but they've said 2060. And they have an interim target of around 2030 where they say their emissions are going to peak. So China's emissions were still going up, but they say they're going to level off around 2030. There is actually some evidence, and you can see it in this diagram. Well, sorry, you can't really see it there. Can you see it? I'll get to that in a minute. There is some evidence China may actually be leveling off. So that's, again, good news. But recognize that unlike other countries in the North, and this goes to the common but differentiated responsibility, they said we have to be able to grow, but yes, we're going to level off and gradually reduce over time. These little buttons there are sort of red light, green light. Are they actually following through with their commitments? So as I said, they made the commitment by 2060. However, it only covers carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is obviously a very, very important greenhouse gas, but there are at least 5 other greenhouse gases that aren't covered by their commitment. So they haven't agreed to reduce emissions of those. To get to their net zero target, they will have to rely, and they've acknowledged this in their policy documents, on carbon offsets and carbon removal. They haven't said how much, so it's not clear. So there's big ifs. Will that technology work? Where will they do that? Will they do that inside China or outside China? How much are they depending on carbon removal in order to reach their net zero target? So those all are a bit of red flags. Okay. China's committed to doing this. Are they actually going to go through the transformation that would be needed for them to do so? Interestingly, and again, this is why China is such an interesting case. You often hear rhetoric, China this, China's not doing that, China, whatever. China is doing amazing things. The amount of renewables China has been growing unbelievably. So here is a chart of fossil fuels compared to renewables in electricity demand. Okay. Electricity demand and how much of it is being achieved by renewables versus fossil fuels. So you'll see if you go back to the early 2000s, it was almost all fossil fuels. Now in 2024, 2025, the majority of electricity is being produced by renewables. So it's very impressive what's happening there. China's also a leader, as you probably know, in various renewable technologies, EV technology, and so on, or at least cheaper EV technology. So it's, again, very interesting. They are definitely working towards that transition, but we should also be conscious of how serious their own commitment is to reduce when their emissions are so high. Okay, so that's China. Canada, I thought I'd put Canada on there. How are we doing? So Canada does have lots of green dots. So, that looks pretty good. What have we committed to? So we have a net zero target. By the way, we're the 11th largest emitter. So we didn't make those charts of the top 10, but if it would have been 11, we would have been there. Our emissions are about 1.5 of the world total. So small, but not insignificant. Okay, that still puts us at number 11 in terms of our emissions. Our net zero commitment, it does cover all greenhouse gases. So that's really good. Okay. It's serious in terms of greenhouse gases and covering all of them, although it excludes aviation and shipping, which are 2 big sources of emissions. That's a little technical footnote. There is no legal limit, however, on separating emissions from removals. So what that means is that there is a huge reliance on unproven technologies that we expect to help us by 2050 in order to reach our target. And it's as high as 34%. And finally, there's no legally binding review mechanism. So it's not clear how we're going to hold the government to account. Okay. So the reason I gave these examples is just to say, you might hear a lot about these things. Net zero, we've committed to this, we're doing that. Dig in, look at what's actually being done, look at what the policies actually are. Are they realistic? The story is a little more complicated. It doesn't mean it's not going to happen, but it's something to be vigilant about and to continue to pay attention to. Okay, let me go now to the last set of comments that I want to make, which is about the politics, some of the politics around this. So one of the things that Professor Hoffman and I, who wrote that article, noticed is that there is a pattern that we see across the world and in all kinds of different scales and all kinds of different levels. And we're not the only ones who have seen this. There are people who study tipping points, for example, who see the same kind of pattern. And that is, you see in climate governance and initiatives, a lot of them get started, they make some progress, and then they stall. Sometimes they stall by doing things that are okay for the climate, but not great. Like we're going to transition away from coal, but we're going to go to natural gas. Well, natural gas isn't great for the climate either. It's better than coal, but then you get stuck in this improvement track. That's the kind of second part. And sometimes there's outright opposition. Sometimes there's backlash, and a lot of people have started to study this backlash. So, what makes it a trap? What makes it so difficult? Well, one thing is the fractal that I was talking about. That there's pushback of all these different systems when you try to do something. The economic system, technology. You need big investments for change. Culturally, we don't want to drive electric vehicles. How do we get people to switch over to that? Politically, and I'm going to get to the political in a minute. So you have to figure out a way to overcome these pushbacks and get over these thresholds when there's lots lined up about making the change that you want. So let me just give you some examples of backlash. I'm sure some of these are well known to you. Maybe some of them you don't know about. So the United States under Trump, this is a very obvious one. Anyone who's following the news know that he's not a big fan of dealing with climate change. And he's done, or his administration has rolled back several major policies that were under the Biden administration to try to address it. So he's withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, cut investment to the tune of $13 billion that was committed to renewable energy. That's just been pulled. So projects that were halfway done are just not being completed. Is trying to gut a lot of regulations, is promoting fossil fuel production, has ended subsidies for consumers, people who want to buy solar panels or buy EVs. Those subsidies are no longer available. So that's a kind of obvious one. This very politically obvious, doesn't want strong climate action. Canada, very interesting case. Mark Carney, who was made actually some big international splashes by promoting strong action on climate change and promoting action in the financial sector. One of the first things that his government did was to end the consumer carbon tax. That's now gone as of April 2025. Okay? You still have an industrial carbon tax, but we no longer have a consumer carbon tax. Why? Because this was a major election issue that the Conservatives ran on, that the Liberals decided was not a winner, was too unpopular, and so they pulled back. They pulled back from the tax. Just I threw up a couple of other examples. You might have heard of the Yellow Vest protests in France. That was over an increase in their carbon price, although it was linked to all kinds of other concerns about the cost of living and employment and other. It was a wider sort of democratic movement in France. And in the global south, we see it too. This isn't just a northern thing. When you impose climate policies, there's often a backlash. So the question is why? So I've given you kind of a broad picture of why, but let me get a little deeper into the politics. So first is the economics. Almost always with climate policies, at least in the early phases, there will be winners and losers. So it's not to say there's always just costs. There will be those who will benefit from it, renewable energy producers, obviously communities who are benefiting from cleaner energy and so on and so forth. And costs can come down over time. But there are often those who have interests in the policy not being followed through on. Interestingly, a lot of the time when you start a policy, it kind of flies under the radar. Oh, isn't that cute? We have a little climate policy. People should buy solar panels. That's terrific. But when that starts meaning that there's a transition away from buying the energy that's being produced, that you produced, where you're making a lot of money from, then it becomes more threatening. And groups mobilize against it, companies mobilize against it. So we see this pattern a lot, where an initiative might get started, as it gains steam, that's when the political opposition, that's when the economic opposition tends to gain support. Second is kind of cultural or ideological positions. Much of the backlash is driven by, or at least supported by, right-wing populist parties. So that was the other article I suggested you look at. This feeds into ideological views of elites. It's, liberal elites that are pushing these policies on us, that are not good for us, that are harmful to us. It becomes a wedge issue that a right-wing party might latch onto in order to get support. So they'll highlight the issue in order to mobilize people who may be less disposed to dealing with climate change. Or it may even affect the identity of a country. So Canada thinks of itself, or Alberta thinks of itself, as an energy superpower, and climate policies go against the identity of some in Alberta who might feel that that is sort of what the province is built on, and shouldn't be undermined by a certain set of policies. Interestingly, though, the interests, as I was hinting at, can be mixed. So take auto producers, for example. They may have been opposed early on to electric vehicles, but as the technology progresses, as markets change, this is part of this kind of fractal interaction, well, then they may see an incentive to start producing electric vehicles to take advantage of that market. And as things start to shift, as there are incentives there, as more people want to buy those products and so on, there can be a tipping point, and the interests are complicated. So you see now in the US, auto companies are not particularly happy with the Trump administration, for example, for taking away subsidies for electric vehicles. So it can become more complicated depending on how the interests line up. So how do you combat this? It's challenging. I'll just throw out a few different ways to think about how to combat it. Of course, if we get in the weeds, it's challenging to do these things, requires a lot of political mobilization, requires convincing politicians, getting committed politicians to act, and so on and so forth. So one is normalizing. Okay, what do I mean by that? Go back to something like the net zero norm. I called it a norm. It becomes a benchmark, a kind of peer pressure. This is the right thing to do. This is the appropriate thing to do. So we can debate about the weeds of the policy, but if a baseline is we have to do something, net zero is a good way to frame it, it becomes very powerful. And I'll just give a couple of examples. Think about a country like Germany. So Germany has faced so Germany had a big energy transition to electricity, basically, Energiewende. A lot of wind power, trying to move away from coal. They've eliminated coal, basically. They've kind of gone back a little bit. And transitioned because they were taking climate change very seriously. The Ukraine war happens. There's pressure on their supplies, some of the supplies, for example, of natural gas, which was part of a transition fuel that Germany was still relying on. Electricity prices are going up. Now, you would think then that would just create this huge backlash, and they would say, forget about Energiewende, forget about the policies, and so on and so forth. But because it was normalized, because there's a strong consensus in Germany that we have to act on climate change, it doesn't mean there's not pushback. It doesn't mean there's not some wiggle room in the policies, but the baseline is never, we don't need to do something about climate. Maybe we need to do something different. Maybe the policy mix has to be different. We are going to have some trouble now, but normalizing can make a big difference. Second, linked to justice concerns. This is something we found over and over and over again in our research. And if you think about the backlash, a lot of it is related to, this is unfair. You want to put wind turbines, in the field next to me? I didn't say you could do that. How come some government is coming and putting them in there? Is this policy really helping me? So how are workers going to be affected by this? So what we're finding in our research, and what many people are finding, is that for climate policy to work, it's not just climate policy. It has to be linked to social justice. It has to be linked to the sort of catchword is just transitions, that you have to pay attention to how people are being affected and how they're living, and they have to see benefits of this and feel that it's what's happening is just and not being imposed on them from outside. And finally, building coalitions of support. So how do you build coalitions of support? Some of it is through the normal, collective action, trying to get people on board, protests, negotiating with groups who you might not otherwise work with, finding common cause. But it's also thinking about ways in which to develop policies where people are benefiting. So as policies roll out, again, this is where this justice thing comes in. The more companies, individuals see benefits, the more they will be willing to kind of join the soft coalition of support for a particular policy. Politics, a lot of outcomes in politics are about coalitions, because groups who are opposed will build counter coalitions, and you will have to try, if you're for a particular set of changes or policies, building coalitions of support is very important. That's it. Thanks very much.